Hello and welcome to this morning's webinar, and it's called Inclusive Computing, and it's brought to you by Computing at School. My name is Wendy MacLeod and I'm one of the Computing at School outreach managers. I work across London and the East of England, and I'm delighted to be to have you with us this morning because we've got lots of interesting things to discuss about inclusive computing. We're going to be covering topics like, what does inclusive computing look like? We're going to be talking about general approaches to teaching children with SEN-D, looking specifically at teaching computing to SEN-D children. We're also going to have a section on strategies for supporting SEN-D children and indeed their parents during this period of lockdown. And then we're going to finish up at the end talking about what is currently available in terms of communities that you can get involved with and future meetings. Can I encourage you to put your questions into the question box as we're going along? And my colleague Tim Wilson, who is also a community outreach manager for the Midlands, he'll be keeping an eye on your questions, and we'll be delighted to put these forward to our panel. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel of guest speakers this morning to you. We have Catherine Elliott. And Catherine is the SEN-D lead for Sheffield e-learning service. And she spent the last 7 years working on ways to make computing accessible for all learners. She's a member of the CAS Include working group, and we're going to be hearing more about that later. And she's also the co-leader of the Sheffield and South Yorkshire secondary CAS community. The second person on our panel this morning is Rory Matthews, and Rory is a Key Stage 5 class tutor and subject leader for computing and media. He teaches at Woodlands Mead, which is a special school in Burgess Hill, West Sussex. He made a major vocational change to become a teacher in 2010 and found himself especially drawn to special needs education. He's now in his 7th year of teaching, supporting SEND learners aged between 14 and 19. And he's also a leader of one of our Computing at School communities. He leads a SEND community in Burgess Hill. And last but not least, we have Emma Salt. Emma has been working in SEN for over 20 years. And since 2008, she worked as the SENCO in a specialist independent school which deals with children who have attachment disorders. She's also a Raspberry Pi educator, and she is also a leader of one of our Computing at School communities in Shropshire. And she also, one of her own children has Down syndrome. So the title of our webinar this morning is Inclusive Computing. But what does inclusive computing mean? And how, as an educator, can we create an inclusive computing environment? So we're going to ask Catherine, first of all, to unpick that first question for us.
Yeah, so we can have the next slide. It's got a few things on that will help us with that one. Inclusion is a tricky term, really. I think that's what we've got to look at first of all. What is inclusion? And where I'm coming from is actually making sure that every child, every young person in our classroom has a sense of belonging, that they feel that, you know, they are included in the learning and they're not just, you know, put in a corner to do something different from everyone else, but they're part of this whole classroom. And that's really, really important. And something that I've been looking at recently, which is quite a nice way of kind of framing an inclusive computing environment, is looking at inclusive design, which really has come out of the design of websites and digital applications, things like this. And Microsoft have done a lot of work on this. And they talk about the fact that actually we should be designing, excuse me, I have a book to prompt me on this one, designing for a spectrum of people who are excluded, and they might be excluded on a temporary, a permanent or a situational basis. So they've got some lovely icons here, and you might look at this and say, well, actually, we might teach a child who has poor motor skills or has a missing limb and they can't write very well. But equally, if you design to support them, you can support the person who's broken their arm, or the parent who has to carry a baby in one arm and can only ever eat or use a computer with one arm because they're carrying a baby at the same time. And actually, if we can design for the widest number of people, it will include not just those children and young people with special needs and disabilities, but a wider section of society as well. And that's where I'm coming from. I just want to read you this quote because it's lovely. So it says, inclusive design doesn't mean you're designing one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging. And so the more ways we can give people to access learning and to present their own learning, then the more inclusive we can be.
I'm just responding to a couple of issues. Some people saying they haven't got audio working, just a couple of people. We did actually consider the importance of actually adding captions to this webinar. We don't have the facility, unfortunately, to do that while we're doing a live broadcast, but it's something that we will be looking into when we release the recording. We will have a version that you will be able to watch at a later date, hopefully with audio if you're having that problem, and also with captions. Emma, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think more on a more practical note of actually producing things inside a classroom base, because I have quite a diverse set of children, even though they're very small classes, is multiple resources to do that, to offer that inclusion. Because a lot of children with SEN-D need these things 4 or 5 times, but will not revisit the same stagnant resource, which is difficult. So it means that if you've got a spectrum of resources that all offer the same learning objectives and the same things for the same skills, but at different levels, it's amazing how you can actually pull that inclusion in, because their outcome will be the same. Their just pathway to get there will be different. And that's, quite helpful for the children in the class.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, on to the next question, which is, what does an inclusive classroom look like? We'll go to Catherine first for that one.
The next slide. So I suppose we've touched on this really, is this idea of, and as Emma said, a range of ways of accessing the learning. So every child can be working on the same topic and the same ultimate sort of skills and basic bits of knowledge, but there'll be lots of different access points in there. And I think we need to make sure that all pupils are engaged in the learning, that they're included in what's happening, and we can use lots of different ways of multimedia and technology to help us with that.
Hey, Rory, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I would say, it's what it looks like, it's what it sounds like, even, what it feels like in the atmosphere, calm and quite relatively quiet, maybe minimizing distractions in the classroom as well, where some classrooms, for a lot of kids, having it very busy is great, but actually if we can keep it quite focused so that there's less to look at apart from what you really want to channel it down to, I would say that's a really good way to go.
And Emma?
On the motivation that we offer as a teacher, if they feel our motivation towards the subject, I think they will try to include themselves. It gives them an energy in themselves and in the room that will lead them through. So you can create a solid foundation. An autistic child, they know we're going to do this. This is how this teacher is going to respond, and by that relationship building, can help them feel like they have inclusion in that classroom, and that they can have a go, and failure is okay. Always, it's a first draft, give it a go. Failure is okay for us as teachers, because not every lesson goes well. Some of them are an absolute disaster, and that's okay. And sometimes it helps them build their own strategies, and then they lead you down the path, and their top tips come from the child, not from what you think you've got.
Yeah, thank you. So based on everything that you've said so far, I'm going to push each of you to give me a top tip or a top 3 tips that you could recommend to the people listening to this webinar that would really help them ensure that they were, you know, creating an environment that is inclusive for computing. What's the top tip or the top 3 tips? Rory, what would you say?
Okay, well, I'm going to say allowing processing time and being prepared to go over things. This ties into what Emma said about different resources for the same point, really. You know, that is to be ready to allow their ideas and their answers, give them time to develop, and be ready to revisit things frequently.
Catherine, thank you.
I'm also going to steal something that Emma said about the personalisation of it. Actually, SEN, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, covers such a wide range, and if you talk to your young people or talk to their parents or talk to the TAs or the SENCO, find out what works for them, because actually what works for one might not work for another, but providing that diversity of things. The other thing, and there was a link on the last slide about cognitive load. Cognitive load is all about this, what we can hold in our working memory and our processing ability. And for a lot of students with SEND, they have a much poorer working memory. So if you can reduce cognitive load, the amount of new material and how you present that, that will really, really help. And scaffolding helps with this, and we'll talk a bit about that further on in the webinar. But if you want to find out a bit more about cognitive load, that quick read link is really, really good.
We weren't going to have questions at this stage. We hadn't planned to, but there's lots of questions that are coming in. I noticed there was one that was asked Catherine about the book that you held up, what the title of it was. So yes. I wonder if you could just let people know what it is. I think it's not so clear on the screen. Oh, that's better, yes.
Yes, we've got that. So it's called Mismatch by Kat Holmes. And I can maybe write it in the chat as well if I'm able to. And basically it's called How Inclusion Shapes Design. And she actually worked for Microsoft. And so although it comes very much from a design point of view, it's all about the facts that actually there is no normal, we're all very, very different, and how we design for people, you know, shapes the world around us, and that we exclude people by the way we design things. And if our classroom is exclusive because of the way we present our information, then, you know, we need to perhaps examine that one. So I'll put the details in the chat if people want to find that.
Thank you. There's lots of questions coming in specifically to do with programming, and we're going to touch on that in a moment. So hold tight for more information coming up about that. In the next section, we're going to consider some general approaches to teaching children with SEN-D. I'm going to ask you first of all, Rory, let's think first of all about the multimodal sensory approach, which can benefit SEN-D children. Can you explain to the audience what that is and how this approach can help children with SEND?
Okay, yeah, sure. So there's a definition come up on the screen here, which is quite long, but I won't read it all out. But basically, it's the something that some SEN-D children have difficulty with is merging things from different sensory points of view, but which is pretty crucial for us to understand the world. So anything we can do that brings things to them from different sensory points of view is going to help. So I take a very simple example would be putting together a visual cue of somebody's facial expression with an audio cue of what that person sounds like when they're speaking. We get a lot more information from those two things together than we do from one of them on their own.
And Emma, do you want to add anything else?
I think the other one is within SEN-D, we have such a lot of children with sensory processing disorders, and they're very often overlooked because everyone's looking at autism or ADHD. But without the sensory processing responded to, a lot of these children can't bring themselves calm enough like Rory was saying, to actually focus. I use these. They are literally little elastic shoestrings. They're quiet. The children have them in a discussion. You know, a lot of people use tangles and the clickers and things like that, but if you've ever had a full group of children with fiddle toys that click as a teacher, it will drive you insane. These are quiet ones, you don't overload, but they have something to mess with whilst they're discussing. And often that sensory approach isn't planned in to lessons. And actually, to have a plan, you as teachers know which one of your children cannot sit there for more than 5 minutes without staring out the window or playing with a bit of blue tack. Have it ready, because if you have those things ready, you're already addressing and you're already responding to their sensory needs and to the multimodal way of teaching. Then whether you're throwing in videos, ask them to note take. Always map things out so you've got multiple approaches. And I think that's the important thing, because otherwise students will drift, especially if they have, you know, their senses are leading them all over the place. If you did an experiment that they, it's like a mental health thing, and they take away certain senses. And if anybody ever has a chance to try it, it is unbelievable. And they pipe in additional noise and how distracting background noise is to some people. And how, you know, put odd gloves on, or the one thing that got me, they put textured inner soles inside shoes, and all these tiny little things divert, and we don't think of them until you have to suddenly try and live with these things. And that's the one thing that a lot of teachers don't do, because they are teaching for the whole rather than teaching for the individual. And if you want success for all students, you've got to focus on the individuals, especially children you know are struggling. Because if you can't put yourself where they are, you can't see what sensory approach they need. And that, you know, long term, that's important. Once you've built that strategy and they responded to it, you will end up with a far more inclusive classroom, because you won't be spending your entire time asking this child to stop staring out the window, because you responded to their sensory needs, so they'll be listening to you because suddenly you've taken interest in them. And that's important.
Yeah, thank you. So if I can ask you, Emma, then, to keep going with what you're saying, some fantastic ideas there. What's the best way to introduce a new concept to a child with additional needs? And can you talk me through how you would do that?
I rely an awful lot on quite a loud personality and a humour as well. It's breaking down those starter boundaries. If you can't break down the boundary with the child, you can't introduce anything. So that's often the first port of call with these. A lot of young people have come from trauma. Unless you're aware of those triggers for that child, you can't introduce a concept. But once you do start, you know, put yourself in a position where you make a mistake and then let the child notice. So suddenly their stress levels come down. Oh, it's all right. Miss makes a mistake, so it's okay to make mistakes. Bring the stress levels down. And then you'll just find that they're far more receptive to trying to discuss things and build up different ways of doing it. Videos, music. As soon as they're walking in the class, if there's music, something very calming, you'll find that the classroom comes down, and then it's like, oh, straight from the music, nice transition into a video, something that's visual. So you've given them the accessibility to the information. You've removed any literacy boundaries. If you put a pack of textbooks on the table, first thing they'll do is, I can't read that, panic, find a distraction technique to get out of this. Where if it's a video and someone's talking like we are now, and offering information, you will find that they're more likely to go, well, the video said this, so I can answer that question. And it builds confidence and self-esteem. So I think that's, you know, a new concept needs a set of information that they can pull on to build confidence. And then once they've done that, you can start with problem solving and computational thinking, and all those things start coming naturally. So that's where I would start.
And what? Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I'd add something in there as well that I think is important around cognitive load. So I agree entirely, you know, what I was saying. The other thing as well is to make sure that when you're introducing new concepts, that you, as far as possible, you're introducing them using a familiar context, so that you're not everything is new. So for example, if you're talking about repetition in programming, you can do that through dance or music or something that is very familiar to the children already or the young people, and you're not adding extra cognitive load onto that by actually making them think about. So for example, if we do algorithmic thinking, I know people talk about, oh well, what about the steps of making a cup of tea? And actually there's many young people who've never made a cup of tea, and so that's an extra thing to think about as well as the algorithmic thinking. So making sure everything else is as familiar as possible apart from the specific concept that you want to introduce.
Yeah,
thank you. I think that's really helpful. Really good
that
point.
one's quite useful. The other one is the step, an additional layer under that for the scaffolding would be to do something like a jam sandwich and give them the bread and the jam and let them do it.
Yeah, have something tangible.
Something tangible is always good for our types of children.
We're going to talk now about when a teacher's creating a resource, what should he or she consider to ensure that that resource is accessible for every child or student in the class. Catherine, do you want to start with this one, please?
Yes, thank you. So, and I think this is really important because this is just it's a small thing you can do and get into a habit of doing, but it's beneficial for so many pupils, and even some of those who perhaps not aware of who struggle with reading might be able to access things a bit better. So considering things like font, the size of it, you know, make sure it's big enough for people to read. Typeface is important. There's no general consensus on which one specifically is best. We can argue all day about Comic Sans, but something that is sans serif, that is not the spacing between the letters is reasonable, would help. Arial is nice. So Comic Sans works for a lot of pupils as well. Avoiding italic and underline because it's harder to read. Things like colours, and we've had a whole debate about the slides for this. You know, making sure that it's high contrast and you can see, you know, see the text clearly. Ensuring that coloured isn't the only marker of meaning. So if you've got any colourblind pupils and you've said, you know, work out what all the red words mean, then you're not really helping them out with that one. Layout is very important, so lots of white space or whatever your background colour is, you know, giving space between chunks of text. Line spacing at 1.5 is ideal spaces, and the structure of things, so making you using bullet points, you're using titles to guide pupils through the content, and they know where to find things rather than a big block of text, which is, you know, it's horrendous for all of us to read, but particularly for any pupils who struggle with reading and processing. Content, obviously we have to be using specific language, and it's very important to teach the language of computing to help pupils make mental models of the concepts that they're learning. But apart from that, think about plain English. You know, there are tools in Word where you can check the reading level of your text, avoiding jargon and metaphor where possible, and just making it, you know, as plain English as possible, but still using the technical language. And then, as we said before, making sure that you're using pertinent images, not just any old image to make it look nice, but images that will help with giving the information, providing audio support if it's required. Video support is very good. Captions to videos if you've got hearing impaired. All of these things are important.
There's a few questions coming in. So Tim, would you like to choose some of the questions? I think we'll just pause there for a moment because there's lots of interest in what you've said so far. So I think it might be nice just to pause and have some of those questions.
Absolutely. So I've had a question coming in from one teacher here who says, I have students with dyspraxia. How can I How can I support them during programming lessons and theory lessons? That's the first question.
I mean, we're going to talk about ways of supporting children with programming in the next section. I don't know whether Emma and Rory have got anything specific to dyspraxia that would be useful at this point.
Nothing specific, but obvious. The obvious one for people with like dyspraxia would have to actually give them a visual list, not necessarily a visual timetable, but to have a visual stimulant and a written stimulant so that they can almost tick off, and it gives them control of their own track. That can be quite helpful, I've found, with children with dyspraxia.
There was a couple of questions from Kat and Natalie regarding the quiet fiddle toy that you showed, Emma. Can you give some more information about, does it have a specific name?
No, it doesn't, and it's made by a lady I did a lovely training course with from Nurture UK, and she makes them at home, and I bought them from her, and Franklin, her name is, and I don't know if she still manufactures them on large scales, but all they are is shortened versions of the stretchy shoelaces. That's what it is, but it's got a lovely tension to it. You know, a lot of them, you'll hook them onto coats and things, and it is just a nice quiet fiddle. I'll quite happy to contact Ange and see if, you know, she's still got them available, but they were also phenomenally cheap compared to some of the fiddle toys. If you go onto some places, they are exceedingly expensive. You know, a pack of fiddle toys for a classroom, £70. These were about, I don't know, 60, 70p each. So there is that cost implication as well for people, because if you've got a lot of children that you need them, having them easily accessible, and they get lost. So it's worth having a go at. But yeah, I'll contact Ange and see if she's still doing them, then we can forward links to people if they'd like it.
We've got one final question in this section, which is about unconscious bias. I'm going to ask Rory what it is, and what steps can a teacher take to reduce his or her unconscious bias in the classroom?
Okay, so this is something that's often thought of, where we have heard of it, is in terms of gender and racial stereotyping is where it most often is thought of. Like a lot of things, it comes from something like inbuilt in us, which is actually kind of useful, which is that we have to make quick decisions about things to be safe. And so that's kind of where it starts from. But the trouble with that is, if that can actually, this sort of rapid categorization, which is a phrase in the quote, is what our brain is doing. But if we misread those clues, and by being too relying on them too much, we're shifting from those sort of danger detectors to labeling and sort of just assuming things about people because of whatever. It could be what they look like, how they speak, their disability, or whatever, and it can apply to then start thinking, oh, that kind of person can't do this, or indeed they can do something that they can't. So I think where it applies in SEN-D is in assumptions about what learners might be interested in or what they might be capable of doing. And I've actually quite often had, when I tell people what my students do in our special needs school and college, you know, that they're learning coding, I've more than once had the response of, oh, can they do that? You know, like as if there's this they, which is all kids with special needs, and that they therefore would, you know, they're not going to be able to even begin to code. And so that's nice to actually shift people's kind of preconceptions a bit. And clearly there are some limitations in particular areas, but it's about whether we give them the opportunity to start even. And clearly it also it can impact on people's attitudes about employability, which is a big thing for us, especially as they get older in the Key Stage 5 that I'm tutoring. You know, is that people can have preconceived ideas where actually evidence shows that lots of young people with special needs make very good employees, as long as it's mutually there on both sides to sort of tailor things a bit, put a bit of effort into preparing things for them. So and I just it's just important to think there can be biases in the other direction, like in the sort of classic sort of Rain Man scenario of, you know, that autistic people might all be savants of some kind, which clearly is not the case, but mostly it's in the other direction. So yeah, so in terms of what we can do, I'm sure the others will have things to contribute to this, but basically you know, allowing that, I've already mentioned processing time, very important, but also where you can, and it's not always, I know in mainstream less likely to have TAs, but you know, having someone read for somebody or scribe or prompt for them, that just again takes away some of the barriers that they have to getting involved with something.
Okay, we're at the end of this section, so the next slide should say questions, and we're going to pause just for a moment to ask one of the questions that's been put forward. This is a question from Gillian, and she asks, what can be done in a classroom where you have students with noise issues when you have 30 Year 7s in the room? Yeah.
Ear defenders would be
yeah, ear defenders. The other one is going back to having a background music going. You'll find if there's a background music, it does sometimes restrict the volume of the students you have. And in a large class, a lot of people don't put background music on. It doesn't have to be anything particularly loud, but they suddenly have a focus going on in the back of their mind, especially if it's something, you know, all the kids moan about classical music, but you know, that something like that has got a bit of an upbeat, but it's still mellow, can bring noise levels down. And that sounds like it's going to go against the grain, but it does work. Also with a child who has, my little boy has noise problems, and so we will run classical music and cello music and things through the house quite a lot, and he responds less to sudden bursts of noise because he's got there's a constant sound ripple. So that might work for the student. The other one is to let them have headphones and an MP3 player, not isolated, but to isolate their sensory need. It does make it very difficult to teach though when you're trying to put demonstrations in.
Yeah, I do sympathise about the you know, the size of your class you're talking about there, but quite a lot of the kids that I deal with these sort of issues, they're much happier if they've got some control, you know, of the sound, and in fact so intolerant of sound from others, but quite happy if they can make some sound. So although that's, you've got to then integrate that sound, as you said, that's, you know, as Emma says, like they've got their own something they can listen to, and they're controlling what it is to some extent, and that will help, I think.
Thank you. Some useful tips there. We're going to move on to the next section, which is specifically looking at teaching computing, and we've had some questions already. So we'll see if those are answered with the questions that we have, and if not, we'll try to bring some of the questions that you've asked to the panel. The first question is, what opportunities are there for immediate feedback when teaching computing? And I'm going to put this question to Rory and Emma. Emma, would you like to start?
Yeah, I use live journals with them. So, you know, all teachers have heard of learning journals, and generally textbooks and exercise books become those learning journals. I run, all the children put their stuff into PowerPoint, and then we type it in on the network directly in. They have their be able to put their voice in, I can put mine in. They video their own screens, they put their own podcasts in, and it becomes this living journal that they control. And very often they'll put footage in and go, oh, I like this, I want to share. And because they suddenly have, rather than just making a say scratch animation and it's isolated on their machine, they'll do that, and because it goes to a central location, I can then put that up onto the whiteboard and share that immediately. And then around the class, I have got a considerably smaller class than a lot of teachers out there, but then ask so many students to give a positive to what they see on the screen. Then very often when you say, is there anything else you want to know, the child asks for the negative. So you've only ever produced positive feedback for that student for motivational purposes. But the live footages are great, and we have social workers in and out, and the children will really very often pull up these live journals and play the videos. I had Ofsted in, and one of my students stopped my lesson, pulled the Ofsted inspector to the computer and says, no, you need to see this that I did first so that you can see what I'm doing now. And that's it. And nothing speaks louder to them than a child's voice. That works quite well. The peer mentoring is good. The other one is simple on exit slips. But don't get them to write it to you, get them to write it to themselves. Very often, they are their own worst critics. So what I do quite often it's called a tweet slip, and it's got the little bird on it, and they write to themselves, I've done this lesson, I'm not happy with this, and this is what I want to come back to. And then I just give it them back at the next lesson. Pick your slip up. That's what I was unhappy with. Because a lot of them don't remember from lesson to lesson. So something to jog their own memory is actually quite useful. Lots of sites out there like code.org, it marks it as you go. I think there's especially where we are now with lockdown, I'm getting work back all the time because I use things like that will give instant feedback to the child, and video tutorials that they can go back to. I produce my own, so they have my voice, a voice that they're used to, but I also pull video tutorials in for lots of different sites. So because they can control their learning, they do get that feedback, because they'll go, that's wrong, and then they'll go back to the tutorial, find where they went wrong, and they create their own feedback loop, which is quite helpful. The other one is, when you're back in a classroom environment, is have a quick word with a colleague. When you walk past, just bob in and then let the kids show and receive praise from somebody other than their main class teacher. That's quite nice, because then they feel like they're being, other people have got interest in them. And that offers, again, more feedback. So it's those subtle ways of working it out with your colleagues prior to, so that you can offer feedback at that moment. And I think that's the important thing, but it does need a bit of setting up. Websites are the easiest way, but the other ways work too. You just have to move fast sometimes to get your feedback in with them, so it becomes immediate. So,
and Rory, specifically for programming,
well, I'd just say that obviously the programming itself is brilliant, is a fantastic thing for immediate feedback, in that, to take the obvious sort of Scratch example, to actually have something running and be able to change that code and immediately see the impact of that. And so you've got that is very engaging for many learners, I think, is to see the code run and see how it changes things when you just change a number or something. And you're just then, well, you run the code, did it work? Did it do what you expected? Or maybe did it do something that you didn't expect, but it was interesting, that you could maybe use somewhere else, or or something that could be useful that you've just discovered. And so that is, lovely as a thing. And they can then also, because like you say, peer sharing and reviewing, so that oh look, I've just done this, and get the others over to have a look at it. Yeah.
Okay, moving swiftly on to the next question. Rory, could you briefly outline the benefits of using unplugged activities?
Yeah, well, again, you know, this is in a very good way. This harks back to other things that we've mentioned already, and that's it really ties up with the multi-sensory aspect of things that we've talked about. You know, using things where they're using, it's brilliant to be used familiar things. So they've come to a computing lesson, but they're going to use a pen and paper, or they're going to do some drawing or colouring. We might get some wooden blocks out, some Lego, and then cross over things like Numicon from maths and so on. And so by sort of taking it slightly away from the computing and then introducing the concept and taking it through, something actually I've just been looking at for our maths teaching, and we're all looking at, is the maths mastery sort of approach of going from things to pictures to concepts, so abstract sort of ideas in maths. It's a similar sort of idea, you know. So the example we've got up on the screen, I still use things from the classic Computer Science Unplugged, which is all available online to download free, and it dates back, getting on for 20 years, I think now, for 15 at least. Some great things in there. And so the example, which is of, you know, about digitizing an image. How can you turn an, you know, represent an image in numbers? You've just got, I like about it is you've just got one, you've really just got one rule to learn in there, which is, you know, that the first number is always a white pixel. So if it's 0, then it's black. And you just, so you get this one idea across, and then give kids a bunch of numbers, and they can then have the sort of discover what the picture is, and all those resources are there. But it's a fantastic way to get that quite a big concept of how you're going to represent your picture in numbers, which is so fundamental.
We're going on to the next question now, which I'm going to ask Catherine, and this is, what tips can you give teachers to support SEND children when they're programming?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of things here, but I'll kind of rush through them. Firstly, and this is kind of related to the unplugged one, the other thing I was going to say to add to what Rory said was the benefit of unplugged is you don't have the distraction of the technology, because as soon as you've got a bit of technology in the room, then that all the focus is on pressing the buttons or going on the computer or using the iPad, and sometimes it's lost off what the actual learning is. And part of what we can do as well is provide tinker time. So, you know, down in Key Stage 1, or, you know, if you provided Bbot, give them time to press the buttons and find out what it does. And actually, that's some logical thinking exploration time, asking questions about, well, how do you make it do this, is part and parcel of it. But it also gets past that initial kind of excitement of, oh, I've got a device I've got to press the buttons with. The same with Scratch, you know, go and explore what it does, have a little play around and see what happens, and get that out of your system first. Physical computing is excellent, and talking about immediate feedback, actually I did a survey a couple of years back of teachers working in special schools and similar settings, and overwhelmingly they agreed that physical computing was really useful because you have that tangible thing in your hand. So whether or not it's a BBC microbit, or it's a Bbot, or it's some kind of Lego Mindstorms, but that immediate sensory output in terms of LEDs lighting up, or if you've got sound output or movement, helps them make the connection with the program that they've done, and that's really, really useful. Obviously, there are some slight downsides of that, in that sometimes you've then got to debug your program and your physical system, and that can cause some issues, but actually, you know, it's worth persevering with. Scaffolding is really important, and the main framework I like for this is Lee talked about use, modify, create, and you can use this across the computing curriculum, not just in programming, but actually get pupils to use a bit of software first of all to run a program to see what happens to it, then to modify a working program, and then only then create it. And the PRIM model is kind of built on that. So Sue Sentence and a few others have developed this, and there's a link there to look at. And that's really, really good in a mixed ability classroom, because you've got lots of different access points of working with code and with programs. So you might give them a working program and some working code and ask them to predict what happens. You might say, well, here's some code, run it and see if it did what you thought it would, or find out what it can do. Print out some code or show some, you know, on the whiteboard for pupils to investigate. And again, this is quite nice because this can all be done away from a personal computer. So if you have a lack of resources in school, or pupils are distracted a bit by the technology, a lot of this can be done away from the computer. Sorry, that was my microphone. So they can investigate the code and answer questions about it. What does this do? What do you think this does? They can then modify working programs, and that's brilliant because it takes some of the risk away from it. So they know that actually they could just change a little bit of it. They could change the sprite, they could change a parameter here, they could just do a small adaptations but still have almost guaranteed success. And that's really important for some pupils with SEN, to have that confidence to do this. And then only then you get into the make kind of side of it. And so what you can do then is you can have pupils all working around the same project, but some of them will be just investigating and modifying, some will be creating their own versions of it, some will be running and predicting, and you have lots and lots of ways of interacting with the code in the program, and that helps you develop an inclusive classroom.
Thank you. The next question is about Scratch specifically, which is a program that is used by many children and students to introduce them to programming. What accessibility features are available in Scratch? Emma, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I have my students linked up to my teacher account, because you can actually have a proper teacher account now, and you contact Scratch and they will check on your that you're a teacher and your school, and then they will give you authorization, and you can link, and the students can share, which is really nice because it gives them a good control system, and it also makes your marking quicker, because to log on to, you know, if you've got 30 children, 30 different computers to mark, that is unbelievable. The other one I use quite often is the Microbit Block Coder, which is a simpler programming platform than Scratch. Scratch does an awful lot, and it links up to a lot of different physical tech, especially when you start importing different additional code blocks in, where the Microbit can start off very, very simple. So sometimes I will, you know, allow them to use different platforms for the coding. They're all block coding, but it tiers that support. Scratch has got an awful lot of tutorials out there, and you do need to be next to them, but they also have the offline editor. So it is one of those things where children do suffer from distraction, especially when they're on the internet, and it's like, oh, I'll just look at the offline editor that Scratch offers that a lot of other platforms don't, is absolutely invaluable, because you can put them into that space. You don't need an internet connection. And that's quite helpful for children, because it takes away those distractions that for some children can be absolutely irresistible. It's not that they're trying to be, you know, terrors in the classroom, just their curiosity builds, and it's like, oh, well, I'll just go and look. Then suddenly they drift and they follow their own path, which I think a lot of adults do when they're on the internet. But that offline editor is a really nice link that can help. And then obviously tutorials are out there to build independence for the students are quite useful. And because Scratch is so frequently used across Key Stage 1, 2 and 3, there's a lot of resources out there to offer support, and I think that's important. You know, there's a huge amount of programming platforms. Alice, it's a lovely platform, but very, very few people use it because there's not a lot of resources out there to support you as a teacher. So the support with Scratch is the main one.
On the next few slides, we have got some information that our panelists kindly shared to do with accessibility features and other programs that they wanted to recommend. We are running short of time for this webinar, so I wonder, Tim, if you could just scroll through those. We'll move on, but just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to download it and listen to it again. And some people in the questions were saying they couldn't take notes quick enough from what you were saying, so thank you for that. But also there is a handout available that you should be able to see that you can download, and that's all the slides that we're sharing at the moment. So we're going to skip forward, and I think we'll actually move to the next section. So you can see some of the recommendations here. Barefoot, keep going please, Tim. Keep going to the next section. Yes, I think it's important just to mention the current situation that we find ourselves in. I have a SEN child of my own who has ADHD, and as a parent of SEN-D child in lockdown, it's important to, at the moment particularly, to think about ways that we can support these children and also indeed their parents during this period of lockdown. So just want to put this question to the panel, and who would like to answer this one?
I'll just chip in a small point, which is just about the home timetable. With lots of kids who are ASC in particular, not just ASC, but have a very strong sense of home and school, and never the twain shall meet. And so maybe not making the home timetable, doesn't have to copy the school timetable too much, you know, sort of slip it in there. So it's like got a different home flavour to it.
I think the other one is, I was doing something the other day, the amount of parents at the moment that are traumatizing themselves because they feel like they've got to do and they've got to step up and manage the level of input that we're doing. That can't be done in a home environment. I've got 2 children at home myself, and I'm teaching here, and to teach them, and I'm trained to do this. It's not easy, but it's looking at those other things you can, the suggestions, like if you want to do algorithms, go bake a cake. Their instructions, and build that, those butterfly moments of, oh, we could do this. Let's go. Little girl wanted Smarties, so we did a bit of practical science. Why did that work? What moved faster? And computing is really good for that, because there are an awful lot of things that kids will play with. Most kids have got tech, and they'll go, well, what's this? Drop a new app on there, drop the Scratch Junior app on there. But parents don't know to look for these things. So, but drip feeding that through to them. I think an awful lot of schools and parents felt very overwhelmed because they had to send out great big packs of stuff. You know, Seesaw, drip feed it in to your communication system with the parents, and then parents don't feel, they gave us all this at the beginning and I've run out. What do I do now? And it's that communication, I think, is huge for parents right now, because they're concerned they're doing it wrong. The children are often very much, I'm not picking a pencil up at home. Well, don't. Do something different that gets you the same results, the same outcome, but via a different route than you would use in a school. But suggestions come through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, some schools are sending out huge amounts of work, and for some pupils, and as you say, for some parents, this is just not practical. And actually at this point, it's far more important, I think, that we're looking to consolidate previous learning rather than getting to learn anything new. And it's a really good time to make sure that, you know, all of your pupils are accessing some of the key skills. So get them practicing their typing skills and mouse skills at this point, because that's such a barrier to some pupils, but they can do some of that. And they can, you know, there's some lovely games out there to do these things, but don't give too much new stuff to learn at this point, because actually there's going to be a limit to how much they can take in. You know, providing templates and working programs to modify is one way to scaffold them at home, making sure you've got accessible materials, short tasks, practical things. But actually, for most of our young people, and particularly those with SEND, you know, for them to feel safe and secure at home, and you know, to promote their well-being is just as important at this point than actually learning computing. So, you know, I think not overloading too much there, but there is, yeah, there's some nice little tasks that can be done. I know that the NCCE has just produced some home learning and some home teaching resources on their website, and it's worth having a look at those. There's some, you know, they've modified some of the barefoot materials for home learning and things like that. So there's some nice things that can be put out.
We've got a few minutes left. So I just want to move to the final slides, which were to do with looking ahead. Catherine, if you could very briefly explain about CAS Include, and on these last two slides of the webinar, these are further opportunities for all the people that have tuned in this morning to join into further discussion, webinars, community meetings that are happening. So we're just going to briefly talk through these. So Catherine, yes, if you could just tell us what CAS Include is and where they can find out more information.
Yeah, so CAS Include is a working party from Computing at School that looks at diversity and inclusion, making sure that the greatest number of students can access computing regardless of background, ethnicity, gender, special needs, etc. And there are a couple of toolkits on there. At the moment, we need to create some more material on here, but if anyone feels they want to get involved and help us create materials, we're just volunteers who are trying to promote diversity and inclusion. So there's a link there, or you can tweet us if you're interested in that. There is an NCC online course on creating an inclusive classroom, which covers quite a lot of the things we've spoken about today. So if you wanted a bit more time to kind of process it and reflect on your practice, then that's a really good one to do. Sign up via teachcomputing.org. SENDcomputing.info is a website I set up with a colleague, Matthew Parry, basically just to collate a lot of the information, the resources, the guidance, useful tips on your programming, multimedia apps, some of the research that's out there. And so do go and have a look at that as well, because this is just interesting ways of maybe how you might look at Scratch and some other sort of programming languages that are out there.
I'm glad that you mentioned Matthew Parry, because on the final slide, he's actually running a community meeting, and you're able to sign up for that on the Computing at School website. It's happening next week on Tuesday, the 12th of May. And I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to many of the questions that have come in from all the people that have been tuning into our webinar this morning. However, can I encourage you to join this community meeting? You will be able to ask questions there, and also indeed the other communities that Rory and Catherine and Emma are part of. Again, opportunities to engage with our panelists this morning in the future. There is a lot of support out there, and to keep that opportunity to keep that professional dialogue going. We've also got mentioned on this last slide our CAS Inspire programme, and this webinar is brought to you as part of that. There are many other different webinars that are being hosted in the coming months, so please have a look at that part of our Computing at School website. And there's nothing else to say really, apart from a massive thank you to Rory Matthews, Catherine Elliott and Emma Salt for your contributions this morning. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you found it useful. I certainly did, as a parent of a child with SEN-D. And thank you so much for joining our webinar. And we hope to see you again at future Computing at School events. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.